At 10 o'clock in the morning on September 25, 1942, a brand new Navy ensign brought a massive fighter toward the deck of the USS Sangamon. He was fresh out of training, his uniform still crisp, his hands tight on the controls. Nerves ran through him, so hard they felt electric. The aircraft he was trying to tame was the Navy's newest pride, the Vought F4U Corsair, painted a deep navy blue and built around raw power. From the outside, it looked lethal. Its inverted gull wings dropped low and then curved upward, like a raptor folding its shoulders before a strike. Engineers in Connecticut had celebrated it as an aerodynamic triumph. Inside the cockpit, the young pilot saw something else. To him, it felt like climbing into a coffin with a spinning blade bolted to the front. The landing approach went wrong almost immediately. As he rolled onto final, the world disappeared. The Corsair's nose stretched 14 feet forward, a long aluminum tunnel packed with the largest engine the Navy had ever mounted in a fighter. When he raised the nose to bleed off speed, that enormous snout lifted and erased everything ahead of him. The carrier deck vanished. The landing signal officer vanished. Even the horizon and the ocean were gone. He was guiding a 3-ton machine at 80 knots while staring at gauges, trusting that the ship had not slipped out from under him. The airplane drifted to the left. On deck, the landing signal officer swung his paddles in sharp, urgent motions. None of it mattered. The pilot could not see him. He was flying on instinct and hope. He pulled back the throttle and braced. The Corsair dropped hard, like a safe kicked out of a window. The landing gear slammed into the wooden deck with enough force to rattle the entire carrier. But instead of settling, the aircraft rebounded. The landing struts were too rigid. They did not absorb the impact. They hurled the fighter back upward. The Corsair bounced over the arresting wires that were meant to catch it and kept moving. Panic hit. He shoved the throttle forward, trying to claw back into the air. The engine answered with overwhelming torque. The giant propeller bit into the air and twisted the airplane sharply to the left. The wing dipped. The tip of the propeller struck the deck and exploded into fragments. The aircraft flipped, cartwheeling into the barrier. Flames and twisted metal followed. Deck crews rushed in with foam, dragging another shattered body from another ruined airframe. This was no isolated mishap. It was becoming routine. By 1942, the Corsair's growing reputation had little to do with fighting Japan. It was gaining notoriety for killing its own pilots. In the ready rooms, conversations dropped to whispers whenever its name came up. No one called it Whistling Death yet. Instead, they called it the Ensign Killer. Some muttered bent wing widowmaker. The elegant curves and massive engine did not suggest superiority. They suggested danger. The root of the problem was straightforward physics. Vought's designers had not simply built a fighter. They had constructed an engine with wings attached. At its core sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp. 18 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower. At that moment, it was the most powerful aircraft engine in existence. It was as large as a compact car and delivered force like a locomotive. To convert that power into thrust, the Corsair needed a propeller 13 feet and 4 inches in diameter. That dimension created the central dilemma. On a standard airframe, a propeller that size would strike the ground during takeoff. Longer landing gear could raise the nose, but extended gear legs are fragile. On a carrier deck, where landings are violent by design, long gear fails. The engineers found a workaround. They bent the wings downward at their roots. By lowering the wing attachment points, they could keep the landing gear short and sturdy while still lifting the propeller clear of the deck. On paper, it was an elegant answer. In practice, it introduced new problems. The cockpit sat far back behind the huge engine and fuel tank. The pilot felt removed from the nose, as if driving from the rear seat of a bus. On the ground, the aircraft pointed upward at such a steep angle that straight taxiing was impossible. Pilots had to weave left and right just to check whether a mechanic stood in front of them. In the sky, the Corsair was fast and powerful. During landing, it was blind and unpredictable. That combination unsettled Navy officials. The Bureau of Aeronautics studied crash reports and grew uneasy. They valued consistency. They wanted an airplane that a farm boy from Iowa could bring onto a heaving deck in bad weather without dying. Predictability mattered more than elegance. The Corsair did not offer predictability. It behaved like an untamed animal. Fortunately, another option existed. Grumman was producing the F-6F Hellcat. Compared to the Corsair, the Hellcat seemed plain. It lacked dramatic curves. It did not resemble a racing machine. Its shape was blunt, almost awkward, but it was straightforward to handle. Its landing gear spread wide and planted firmly on the deck. The cockpit sat higher, giving pilots a clear forward view. The Hellcat obeyed inputs without surprises. Inside offices far from the Pacific fighting, the decision took shape. The Navy chose to rely on the Hellcat. The Corsair was judged unsuitable for carrier service. For an aircraft meant to dominate the fleet, it was a crushing verdict. The fastest fighter in the sky had been sidelined. Pilots felt relief. They would not be assigned the Ensign Killer. They would fly the stable, forgiving Hellcat instead. But the Navy had already purchased hundreds of Corsairs. They could not discard them. So they looked for another solution, as militaries always do when faced with equipment they would rather not use. The Navy did not scrap the aircraft. They handed it to the Marine Corps. From the perspective of admirals in pressed uniforms, the logic was clean. Marines operated from land. They launched from rough island strips, not rolling carrier decks. If the Corsair could not behave on a ship, perhaps it would manage on a patch of crushed coral carved out of the jungle. It was a transfer no one wanted to advertise. It felt like an older brother passing down a dangerous car he did not trust himself. On Guadalcanal, the Marines had no idea they were receiving the Navy's rejected project. They were simply running out of options. By late 1942, the air campaign over the Solomon Islands had become a grinder that chewed through pilots and machines alike. Marine squadrons were still flying the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. The Wildcat could take punishment, but it belonged to an earlier chapter of the war. It was slower than its enemy. It climbed poorly. More often than not, when a Marine pilot glanced upward, he found a Japanese Zero already positioned above him. The Mitsubishi Zero ruled those skies. It turned tighter. It climbed faster. Its pilots understood the advantage and used it without mercy. They would dive through Marine formations, fire, then climb back toward the sun where the Wildcats could not follow. The Marines were holding ground with determination and little else. Losses mounted. Aircraft were patched with whatever was available. They were tired of reacting. They wanted something that could dictate the fight. Then the crates showed up. In February 1943, VMF 124 arrived on Guadalcanal with the first Marine Corsairs. The pilots stepped out of machines with strange, bent wings. Infantry Marines, living in muddy foxholes crowded with insects and standing water, stared at the newcomers. Compared to the squat Wildcats, the Corsairs looked enormous. They seemed aggressive even at rest. Their lines suggested speed and power before the engines ever started. But the reputation of the Ensign Killer had traveled ahead of them. Stories filtered through tents and maintenance areas. Mechanics murmured that the Navy had turned these airplanes away. They warned that the landing gear was flawed, that forward visibility was almost non-existent. Some claimed the engine threw oil onto the windshield, blinding pilots at the worst possible moment. The Marine aviators studied their new fighters with caution. They were trading a familiar, underpowered aircraft for something faster that might just kill them first. Meanwhile, Navy officials in Pearl Harbor and Washington felt confident. They believed they had protected the fleet and shifted the liability elsewhere. In their minds, the Corsair would quietly disappear, another promising design that failed in practice. They assumed the Marines would struggle, crash the aircraft, and eventually request Hellcats. They misunderstood who they had handed it to. Marine pilots were not looking for comfort. They were not looking for simplicity. They wanted an airplane that could catch a Zero and end a fight quickly. Landing manners ranked far below combat performance. What the Navy dismissed as a problem might become an advantage in the right hands. The Solomon Islands offered no gentle proving ground. Guadalcanal was hardly an airfield. Henderson Field was carved from mud and crushed coral. After heavy rain, vehicles sank. In dry weather, dust clouds filled the air and crept into engines. The heat pressed down constantly, thick and damp. Into this environment came the Corsair, a machine built with tight tolerances and fine engineering, now expected to survive in conditions that corroded tools left overnight. The mechanics of VMF 124 quickly confirmed that the aircraft carried serious flaws. The landing gear stood out immediately. The oleo struts had been tuned for smooth, predictable landings, not rough coral strips. They were overly stiff. When the aircraft touched down, The impact energy was not absorbed. It rebounded. The fighter skipped back into the air. On a short jungle runway, that bounce could carry a pilot straight into the trees beyond the strip. Navy engineers had produced reports describing the issue in detail. On Guadalcanal, the Marines approached it differently. They did not have laboratories or formal approval. They had tools and urgency. The mechanics opened the struts and adjusted the hydraulic pressure themselves. They modified the metering valve, enlarging the small passage that allowed fluid to move through the shock absorber. By increasing that flow, they softened the landing gear response. It was not authorized by the factory. It was improvised, but the change worked. The aircraft began settling onto the runway instead of springing back into the air. Another hazard proved even more lethal. The Corsair could stall abruptly. In most aircraft, when speed drops too low, both wings lose lift together and the nose dips forward in a predictable way. The Corsair did not always behave like that. Because of the engine's torque and the shape of the bent wings, the left wing often lost lift before the right. During landing, as speed bled off, the airplane could snap violently, rolling inverted and striking the ground upside down. This sudden roll had already cost lives. The answer did not emerge from a design office. It came from trial and error by pilots and crew chiefs. They discovered that by slightly disturbing airflow over the right wing, they could force it to stall at nearly the same moment as the left. They attached a small strip, about 6 inches long at first made from wood, later from metal, to the leading edge of the right wing. This simple addition acted as a stall strip, changing the airflow just enough to tame the aircraft's worst habit. The modification did not look impressive. That small strip on the wing resembled a random piece of debris. Yet that narrow wedge balanced the lift between both wings. A machine once blamed for killing young officers was steadied by something no larger than a ruler. Forward visibility remained a problem. The long nose was not optional. It housed the fuel and the engine. Removing it was not a solution. Instead of redesigning the airplane, the Marines redesigned the technique. The official Navy handbook called for a long, straight final approach, lining up from far out and descending steadily. The Marine pilots ignored it. They developed what became known as the curved approach. Rather than coming in straight, the Corsair stayed in a constant bank during final. The pilot kept the aircraft tilted, holding a sweeping turn so he could see the runway through the side of the canopy. He did not look over the nose. He looked around it. Speed bled off during the turn. Only at the last moment, when the wheels were nearly touching the coral, did he level the wings. To anyone watching from the ground, it looked reckless. The timing had to be exact. Level too soon, and the airplane would drop hard. Level too late, and the wingtip could strike, sending the aircraft cartwheeling. There was no margin for hesitation. They practiced until the maneuver felt automatic. The aircraft that had once been blind on approach became controllable. With landing under control, attention shifted to performance in combat. The Navy's focus had been on the landing gear. The Marines focused on the engine. The R-2800 Double Wasp did not whisper. It thundered. When the throttle went forward, the airplane did not ease ahead. It surged. The torque was so strong that the airframe wanted to twist. The Marines learned to anticipate and exploit that power. They found the Corsair climbed faster than anything they had previously flown. It dove with authority. Above all, it was fast. The Wildcat topped out around 320 miles per hour. The Corsair could reach 417. In air combat, that difference was decisive. Speed meant choice. A Corsair pilot could decide when to engage and when to disengage. He was no longer trapped in a defensive fight. But velocity alone did not win battles. Tactics mattered. The Zero still dominated in a turning contest. It could pivot tightly and quickly. A Corsair pilot who tried to match that maneuvering would lose. Fully loaded, the Corsair weighed about 12,000 pounds. The Zero weighed roughly half. Attempting to outturn one in a Corsair was like trying to spin around in a narrow space while burdened with extra weight. Veterans who had survived the Wildcat days adjusted their thinking. They abandoned traditional dogfighting. They treated the Corsair like a precision weapon. Climbing high, often above 20,000 feet where the engine performed strongly, they searched for Zero formations below. Once positioned, they pushed the nose down. This was the boom and zoom method. The Corsair dove from altitude, gathering tremendous speed. The pilot aligned on a target, fired a brief burst from the .50 caliber machine guns. and then used his momentum to climb back upward. It was a strike and withdrawal. Japanese pilots often did not realize they were under attack until one of their aircraft was already burning. By the time they reacted, the Corsair was climbing away, preparing for another pass. The first serious trial came in February 1943. It was no exercise. It would later be remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. American bombers and fighters, including the new Corsairs, headed north toward Japanese shipping near Bougainville. The mission was expected to be routine. Instead, they encountered approximately 50 Zeros. The sky turned into a chaotic engagement, aircraft twisting and crossing in every direction. Many Corsair pilots were new to combat. Under pressure, some abandoned discipline. A few attempted to turn with the Zeros. They slowed. They separated from support. Japanese veterans exploited those mistakes immediately. 2 Corsairs fell quickly. The Zero pilots studied the unfamiliar aircraft. It looked different and clearly had speed, but the Americans flying it lacked experience. Using superior maneuverability, they isolated and destroyed several of the heavy fighters. In total, the Americans lost 8 aircraft and withdrew. In Washington, analysts reviewed the reports. Losses were noted. It seemed to confirm earlier doubts about the Corsair. On paper, the airplane had entered combat and suffered. The men who flew that day saw something more complex. They recognized that the aircraft lost had been piloted by men who fought on the Zero's terms. The Corsairs that stayed fast, that used altitude and power, survived. They outran pursuit. They absorbed damage that would have destroyed a Wildcat. The Corsair proved durable. It could take punishment. One Marine returned with half his tail assembly damaged and wing panels torn open by gunfire. After landing, he stepped out, brushed shattered glass from his hair, and examined the machine. It was wrecked beyond repair, but it had carried him back alive. He reached out and tapped the scarred fuselage after landing. He understood the difference. In a Zero, he would not have walked away. Japanese fighters were built for lightness. They carried almost no armor and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. A few well-placed rounds could ignite them instantly. The Corsair was constructed for punishment. It absorbed damage and kept flying. But mastering it came at a cost. The lessons were paid for in wreckage and funerals. Over the following weeks, the Marines kept refining their field tactics. They abandoned loose formations and adopted the thatch weave, crossing paths in pairs so each aircraft protected the other's tail. They learned to rely on the engine's power instead of fearing it. They also discovered something unexpected. The high, eerie shriek created by air passing through the oil cooler intakes in the wing roots had a psychological effect. The Japanese began reporting a new sound in the sky. They called it whistling death. It meant their advantage was fading. They could not escape by diving. The Corsair dove faster. They could not climb away. It climbed harder. Their only chance was to drag the Americans into a slow-turning fight. But the Marines were no longer taking the bait. The real shift came when radar detected a large Japanese strike force heading down the slot toward Guadalcanal. Bombers and fighters were coming in numbers, intent on destroying Henderson Field. The warning echoed across the island. Enemy aircraft at 20,000 feet. Numerous contacts. The scramble order went out immediately. This was not routine patrol. It was defense of their base. Pilots ran to their aircraft. Mechanics who had modified struts and wings spun up the inertia starters. The big propellers began turning slowly, then ignited with smoke and flame as the engines caught. 12 Corsairs rolled toward the runway. They did not bounce on takeoff. The pilots weaved slightly while taxiing, peering around the long noses. One by one they lined up. Throttle forward. The R-2800 engines roared. The fighters surged down the coral strip and lifted into the air, landing gear folding into the fuselage. They angled upward, climbing hard toward altitude. Above them, the Japanese formation approached with confidence. They expected to meet struggling Wildcats clawing upward. They expected to brush them aside and bomb the field. They did not expect Corsairs waiting in the clouds. The Marine flight leader spotted the incoming formation. He saw opportunity, not fear. His radio call was brief. Drop tanks. Follow me. External fuel tanks fell away. The aircraft became lighter and cleaner instantly. Throttles pushed into war emergency power. Water and alcohol injection cooled the cylinders, allowing a temporary surge of horsepower. The Corsairs accelerated. Noses dipped. The dive began. Air rushed through the wing roots. The familiar whistle rose, building into a piercing shriek. Unlike other aircraft that produced a deep roar in a dive, the Corsair emitted a sharp, harmonic scream. To Japanese pilots sitting in open cockpits, the sound cut through everything. By the time they identified the source, the attack was already upon them. What followed was not balanced combat. For over a year, the Zero had dominated because of its light weight and maneuverability. It floated and turned effortlessly. The Corsair attacked with mass and speed. In a steep dive, the heavy fighter accelerated rapidly. The airspeed needle climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. Many aircraft would have lost wings at such speeds. The Corsair held together. Vought had engineered it with strength in mind. The main wing spar was massively reinforced. There was no flutter, no structural failure. The pilots trusted the machine completely. They rode the screaming dive almost to the treetops. The Japanese formation fractured. Zeros reacted the way they always had against American fighters. They banked sharply, pulling tight turns, attempting to draw the attackers into a horizontal fight. That tactic had worked flawlessly against Wildcats. The American would try to match the turn, bleed off speed, and become an easy target. The Corsair pilots refused to play that game. When a Zero banked hard, the Corsair simply stayed fast. It streaked past at 400 miles per hour and then pulled straight up into a steep vertical climb. It was strength against nimbleness. The Zero pilot would complete his tight circle expecting to see his opponent drifting into his sights. Instead, there was nothing but empty sky. Then he would glance upward. High above, the Corsair hung in the air, carried by the energy of its dive and the raw output of its 2,000 horsepower engine. It was already setting up for another attack. The Japanese pilot had no answer. He was low, slower, and reacting. The Marine was above, choosing the moment. It was the difference between hunter and hunted. When the Corsair pilot finally pressed the trigger, the effect was brutal. The F4U carried 650 caliber heavy machine guns in its wings. That was not simply heavy armament. It was concentrated firepower. The guns were aligned to converge at a set distance. When the pilot steadied the sights and fired, 6 streams of armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the Zero almost simultaneously. The Japanese fighter had no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Its lightweight construction made it agile, but vulnerable. When those rounds connected, the Zero did not limp away trailing smoke. It tore apart. Sections of wing separated. Fuel ignited in sudden bursts of flame. What had been a dangerous adversary seconds before became falling wreckage. The advantage was not only mechanical. It depended on the men flying the aircraft. The Corsair tended to attract a certain kind of pilot. Many were not the polished officers from the pre-war Navy culture. They were unconventional, sometimes rough around the edges. One of the most well-known was Major Gregory Pappy Boyington. He had flown with the Flying Tigers in China and returned to the Marines with a reputation for hard living and aggression. He gathered a squadron of pilots others had overlooked, later known as the Black Sheep, and put them in Corsairs. Boyington appreciated the aircraft's personality. It was loud, aggressive, and unforgiving to the careless. He taught his men that its reputation as the Ensign Killer came from misunderstanding, not destiny. If flown with confidence, it rewarded decisiveness. Under his leadership, the Black Sheep dominated the skies over Rabaul. In a matter of months, they claimed 97 enemy aircraft. Boyington himself accounted for 28. Daily missions against Rabaul became legendary. The area was saturated with anti-aircraft guns and fighter defenses. It was considered one of the most heavily protected zones in the Pacific. Because the Navy had deemed the Corsair unsuitable for carriers, the Marines operated from distant island fields. That meant long flights. Pilots endured hours in cramped cockpits, engines vibrating beneath them, heat pressing through the canopy. The Corsair's fuel capacity made those missions possible. It could reach Rabaul, engage for roughly 20 minutes, and return home. Japanese commanders realized that distance offered no security. Aircraft parked on the ground were strafed. Fighters in the air were intercepted. The imbalance became clear in smaller encounters as well. In one case, a single Corsair pilot found himself facing 6 Zeros after losing contact with his flight. By earlier standards, that situation meant certain defeat. Instead of freezing, The Marine advanced the throttle fully and engaged water injection. The engine responded immediately, delivering war emergency power. The Corsair surged forward. The pursuing Zeros appeared almost stationary by comparison. In straight flight, they could not keep up. The pilot extended the gap, climbed to altitude, then turned back toward the fight. Diving again, he shot down one Zero and crippled another before using his speed to withdraw. What began as an ambush ended as a demonstration of superiority. He returned to base confident in the aircraft's capabilities. He later remarked that the Corsair had a rare quality. It could place a pilot in danger and then provide the means to escape before the enemy understood what had happened. Meanwhile, Japanese losses mounted. Experienced aviators were being eliminated by comparatively young American pilots with limited training time. The aircraft itself played a central role. The Corsair tolerated errors. Its reinforced structure endured high G-forces. Armor behind the seat offered protection. The radial engine could continue operating even after losing a cylinder. The Zero offered no such margin. A single mistake or a single burst of fire often proved fatal. The psychological effect was significant. Japanese pilots began avoiding engagements with the bent wing fighters. If they saw the distinctive gull wing outline against the sun, some chose not to take off. The name Whistling Death reflected both the sound in a dive and the outcome of meeting it. By late 1943, the exchange ratio told the story clearly. It was not 2-to-1 or 5-to-1. It approached 11-to-1. For every Corsair lost, roughly 11 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. An 11-to-1 exchange ratio is almost unheard of in combat. It signals more than success. It signals dominance. At that point, the opponent is no longer competing for control of the sky. He is simply surviving in it. Senior Navy officers began reviewing dispatches from the Solomon Islands. The numbers were undeniable. Combat reports listed victory after victory. Gun camera film showed Japanese aircraft breaking apart under fire from the same fighter once dismissed as unsuitable for carriers. It became clear that the earlier judgment had been wrong. The aircraft they had set aside was outperforming expectations in combat. What had been handed off as a problem had become a decisive weapon. Meanwhile, engineers at Vought had not stood still. They examined the field modifications made by marine mechanics. The softer landing gear adjustments, the stall strip on the wing, and the curved landing technique were studied and formalized. The landing gear was redesigned to reduce bounce. The pilot seat was raised slightly to improve forward visibility. The canopy was reworked into a clearer bubble design, eliminating structural framing that obstructed the view. By 1944, the Corsair was ready to return to carrier decks. Navy pilots who had been flying the steady but less dramatic Hellcat noticed the difference immediately. The Corsair offered greater speed and raw power. Its earlier reputation as the Ensign Killer was fading. A new reputation was forming. The need for speed became urgent as Japanese tactics shifted. Rather than engaging in conventional dogfights, many enemy pilots began launching deliberate suicide attacks against American ships. The Hellcat performed well, but in some cases it lacked the acceleration needed to intercept a fast-diving aircraft before impact. The fleet required an interceptor that could launch quickly and climb aggressively. That meant bringing back the Corsair. When Navy Corsair squadrons finally deployed aboard carriers, the return carried a sense of correction. The same aircraft once judged unfit was now seen as essential. Pilots applied the curved approach technique. They respected the engine's torque and learned its habits. Once airborne, they exploited its performance. The bent-wing fighter returned to sea not as a liability, but as protection for the fleet. By 1945, operations in the Pacific had intensified. The Allied advance moved steadily toward the Japanese home islands. The campaign for Okinawa became the largest and most violent engagement of the Pacific theater. Above that battlefield, Corsairs were everywhere. They launched from large fleet carriers, smaller escort carriers, and improvised island strips. The aircraft once rejected was now central to operations. The 11-to-1 ratio remained a powerful statistic. For every Corsair lost, approximately 11 Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Such numbers reshaped campaigns. At Okinawa, however, the threat was not limited to enemy fighters. The fight extended to fortified ground positions. Japanese forces occupied caves, bunkers, and reinforced concrete emplacements. Artillery and mortar fire targeted advancing Marines. The infantry needed consistent air support. The Corsair adapted to that role as well. It had already proven itself in aerial combat. Now it demonstrated its effectiveness as a strike platform. The combination of strong wings and a powerful engine allowed it to carry heavy ordnance. It could haul up to 4,000 pounds of bombs, a payload comparable to that of larger bombers on extended missions. In addition, it carried rockets, including 5-inch projectiles capable of striking with significant force. It also delivered napalm. For Marines pinned down on the ground, the deep roar of the R-2800 engine signaled assistance. The aircraft became known among infantrymen as the sweetheart of Okinawa. When units called for support, Corsairs arrived quickly. They circled low, sometimes close enough for pilots to see friendly troops clearly below. Napalm canisters tumbled downward, igniting defensive positions. Rockets were fired directly into cave entrances. Machine guns swept trenches and exposed positions. The Corsair was no longer solely an air superiority fighter. It was clearing obstacles for advancing ground forces. It emerged as one of the earliest examples of a true fighter-bomber, capable of controlling the airspace and delivering decisive support to troops on the ground within the same day. One episode from Okinawa captures how far the Corsair had evolved. A Marine unit was trapped along a ridge, pinned down by intense fire. Ammunition was nearly gone, and enemy forces were closing in. A group of Corsairs arrived overhead, but their bomb racks were empty. They had already released their ordnance. Many pilots might have broken off and returned to base. These did not. Instead, they rolled into dive after dive, charging toward the Japanese positions. The aircraft screamed as air rushed through the wing root intakes. At the last moment, they pulled up and climbed away. They had no bombs left. In some cases, they had little ammunition, but the sound alone was enough. Japanese soldiers, familiar with that shriek, kept their heads down. The repeated feints created just enough confusion and hesitation for the Marines on the ridge to withdraw. The aircraft itself had become a psychological weapon. When the war ended in August 1945, many piston-engine fighters were retired. Jet aircraft were entering service. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the Hellcat were gradually phased out or sold abroad. The prevailing view was that propellers belonged to the past. The future was defined by jet fuel and swept wings. The Corsair remained. Navy planners recognized a practical reality. They still required an aircraft that could operate from carriers, carry substantial bomb loads, and remain over a battlefield for extended periods. Early jets offered speed, but they consumed fuel quickly and lacked endurance. While other aircraft were dismantled, the Corsair stayed on production lines. Vought continued building them until 1953. It became the longest continuously produced American piston-engine fighter. The aircraft returned to combat during the Korean War. By then it was facing jet-powered MiG-15 fighters built in the Soviet Union. On paper, the comparison was uneven. The MiG held a speed advantage of nearly 200 miles per hour. Yet the Corsair retained maneuverability at lower speeds. If a MiG pilot slowed and entered a turning engagement, he risked losing. In 1952, Marine Captain Jesse Falmer shot down a MiG-15 using his 20mm cannons. It was a striking contrast, a propeller-driven design from the late 1930s defeating a jet from a new era. The Corsair gradually left United States service in the mid-1950s, but it continued operating elsewhere. French forces used it in Indochina and later in Algeria. The Honduran Air Force flew Corsairs until 1979. For decades after its first prototype flew, the aircraft was still in use. The fighter, once labeled too dangerous to land, had outlasted many of the machines that were meant to replace it. Today, when a Corsair appears at an airshow, it draws attention immediately. Parked with its wings folded, it looks compact and ready. When the engine starts, the vibration carries through the ground. And when it passes overhead, that distinct whistle can still be heard. The sound once associated with fear remains part of its identity. The significance of the Corsair extends beyond statistics or bomb loads. It demonstrated a broader lesson. Early critics sought predictability and safety. The aircraft did not initially provide either. Marine pilots approached it differently. They adjusted procedures. They modified components. They adapted themselves to the machine instead of discarding it. The aircraft began as an ambitious design centered on an oversized engine. It was criticized and reassigned. In the hands of determined pilots, it became one of the most effective fighters of the war. Its story illustrates how unconventional equipment, when understood and refined, can alter the outcome of conflict. When you see the distinctive bent wing silhouette in a museum or on screen, remember that it once carried a difficult reputation. It demanded skill and respect. It also delivered results. If this story added something new to your understanding of the Pacific War, consider supporting the channel. Your engagement helps preserve and share these accounts of aviation history. Subscribe for more deep dives into the forgotten history of World War II and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. Thanks for watching, and thank you for helping us preserve the legacy of the Whistling Death.